Jay Sigurd here, Starting Point Podcast. We're talking science, faith, and a whole lot more. Buckle up, because it's go time. Jay Sigurd here. Welcome back to the Starting Point Podcast. We are headed into part 3 and the final part of the miracle of metamorphosis. But before we jump in, again, make sure you subscribe, tell your friends. That helps us greatly. What can you expect today? Well, we're wrapping up this whole thing of talking through of what goes on during metamorphosis. Again, focusing on the metamorphosis of a butterfly, even though there are other creatures that are equally as complex in how they change through life. As a review, we covered 4 major stages: the egg stage, the larva stage, which is the caterpillar, the pupa, which is the chrysalis, and then finally the adult butterfly. And again, as we're going through this, we're just trying to think, can this all be accounted for by undirected processes of nature? That would be Darwinian evolution. Or does it look like maybe just somehow it's actually evidence for design? So as review, the egg stage, again, the butterfly lays an egg on the appropriate plant, which it can actually smell from over a mile away. When they land on the leaf, they actually taste it with their feet, with all the sensors. Very, very, very complex. Then when the egg hatches, it grows in the larva stage up to more than 3,000 times its original size. Again, going like from an 8-pound baby to 3 Asian elephants. We talked about that analogy. It eats its own shell to begin with. Once it's hatched, then it eats plants. And for monarchs, they eat milkweed, which is poisonous, but it knows how to not be affected by the poison and store it to be used as the deterrent for its predators later. Cool how that happened by accident. It sheds its skin 4 to 5 times, making that exoskeleton, growing a larger skin under the smaller skin on the outside. Just bizarre complexity. Then the pupa or the chrysalis, it creates a silk pad underneath a twig or leaf and hangs upside down. And again, you have to picture these things happening one piece at a time and then ending at a certain piece. And that's as far as it goes. And then maybe within the next 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, it goes up to that stage, but then goes to the next point. So at this point, this thing is just hanging upside down under a leaf, very vulnerable to its predators, hanging there, stuck on a silk pad that it makes. So now it's hanging upside down, and it forms that chrysalis around itself like a little sleeping bag. And then most of its cells get broken down through apoptosis or autophagy. The apoptosis is pre-programmed cell death. Certain cells know when to kill themselves, comes in handy actually. And autophagy, that's eating itself. It actually devours itself and retools things to eventually make a butterfly. But it doesn't affect these imaginal discs that it has, because these are little pockets of cells that turn into parts of the butterfly: the legs, the feet, the sensors, the antennae, the complex eyes, and all that. And the reproductive organs are also developing from those imaginal cells, completely different reproductive organs. The heart is retooled while it's beating. The simple eyes of the caterpillar, which can only sense like dark and light, not color, get converted into very, very complex compound eyes with 17,000 individual lenses. We got the color patterns on the wings. We talked about that. Not only how beautiful they are, but how do you create patterns without having it pre-programmed right from the get-go. And then the wings, when they come out, there's a lot of complexities there, but the shingles on them act like solar panels to warm them up, and on and on. Getting to the new stuff. I ended part 2 with a teaser, a quote from the American Museum of Natural History. Here's the quote. Quote, when it is fully grown, the primary goal of a butterfly or moth is to disperse and reproduce, unquote. All right. I asked the question before we ended. Reproduce with what? Well, we know today when the butterfly lays an egg, turns into a caterpillar, the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, comes out as another butterfly, it's going to reproduce with another butterfly. That's a no-brainer, right? Okay, I get that. That's today. What happened in evolutionary history. At some point in history, there were no butterflies. At some point, there had to be the first butterfly. No butterflies, then a butterfly. So it comes out of this chrysalis. What does it mate with? Seriously, it's not just like, oh, that's interesting, and you move on. No, answer the question. And let's say somehow, fortuitously, somewhere else on the planet, some other worm had figured out, quote, figured out how to turn into a butterfly, but it's all the way over in Zimbabwe, and this first butterfly is in Cleveland. I know Cleveland didn't exist in earlier evolutionary history. Work with me. But you got the first guy here in Cleveland, but there happens to be another one in Zimbabwe. Somehow the one in Cleveland takes an Uber ride and then a ship and goes all the way over to Zimbabwe to get there, only to find out, oh, that's also a male. You got two males. That's not going to work. Or if they were both females, that's not going to work. You would need one to accidentally evolve into a male with having all the plumbing for a male, and the other one to accidentally evolve into a female and have all the components a female needs that can work together. And they have to be at the same place at the same time. It's beyond bizarre to believe that just happened through undirected processes of nature. There'd be nothing for it to mate with. And this is not just a problem for butterflies. This is a problem for every time you have a new species. If some defined species is not able to mate with other species, which is typically what they say, they have a hard time defining what a species is, and I'm not faulting them for that. It is kind of hard. Is it a species or not? You got dogs, dingoes, coyotes, and wolves. They're different species, right? Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. But guess what? They can breed together. Well, usually you say a species is something that can't breed with others. Well, they can. So it gets kind of challenging to define a species. But if you truly do have a unique individual that cannot mate with others, what's it going to mate the first time it gets produced? So every single time you have the diversification of creatures, what's it going to mate with? It's a big problem. So I could go on and on and on, and I kind of already have, but trust me, I could have covered so much more, so you can thank me for that later. But here's the all-important question. If what we just discussed, the metamorphosis of a butterfly, from egg all the way through adult butterfly, if that doesn't qualify as evidence of design, then seriously, and I'm being as sincere as humanly possible, seriously, please give me an example of something that would qualify in your mind. Describe something to me that you'd say, yep, that would be evidence of design, definitely. Again, metamorphosis is incredibly complex. If that doesn't qualify, then help me out. Maybe I'm missing something. And we could go through many, many, many other examples of things that are incredibly complex, including DNA and ATP production and just on and on and on. So that's not a rhetorical question. It really isn't just something to think about. But again, this is one of the problems we have with metamorphosis. We'll watch a documentary, and some of them are beautifully produced. I love watching them. But you watch them, isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? And then you say, hey, what do you want to go for lunch? And you move on with your life. It was just kind of an entertaining thing. You don't stop to think about that. Okay, that was fascinating. How did that come about? Just by undirected processes, or is this the beautiful hand and signature of a designer? Again, it's a question you need to answer for yourself. We are now going to move into the migration details, specifically of a monarch butterfly. This is similar to the point where you know a fair amount about this. You've seen some videos, maybe you've seen a documentary, and it's just fascinating, fun to watch, but then you grab lunch afterwards and you move on. I want to think through this a little bit more. Could what migration is be accounted for by undirected processes of nature? So we're going to finish talking about the monarch butterfly here. And again, you're probably familiar with it, but is this an accident or not? So migration, according to National Geographic, is defined as, quote, the seasonal movement of animals from one habitat to another in search of food, better conditions, or reproductive needs, unquote. You got no problem with that definition? I think that's pretty accurate. But this is simply amazing. Well, so is everything else that we covered, but as was the case with discussing metamorphosis, as we look through migration, we're going to be looking at it in steps and seeing, is it an accident or not? Again, to me, this is just design beyond imagination. So you have these monarchs hanging out, eating milkweed largely. Eventually, the milkweed, and we're talking primarily about United States right now. So they're hanging out, eating milkweed, but eventually the milkweed, not being able to handle the seasonal changes in weather, it gets colder, the milkweed goes to seed phase. And the leaves start to kind of dry up and it just goes to a seed. With no milkweed leaves, the monarchs can't lay their eggs successfully because they simultaneously would have to lay the eggs, and then the hatching larva would be eating milkweed and all that. But that's not happening anymore. So as these milkweeds go to seed phase, these monarchs just fortuitously, simultaneously stop their reproductive cycle. How did that happen? Again, this has to happen by making accidental copying errors in the DNA. It's not like these monarchs are saying, hey, did anyone else notice? Is it just me, or does anyone else notice these milkweed are going to seed and we can't really reproduce anymore? So, hey, let's all agree we're just going to stop our reproductive cycles now. Are we in agreement? Okay. Ernie, you're out of here. I mean, that's not what's going on. Again, this is, to me, a design feature. So these monarchs, with the milkweeds going to seed, they focus solely on getting enough nutrition to make the monumental journey that's ahead of them. And this leads to another interesting fact about monarchs. Those that are born in the early spring only live like 2 to 4 weeks. However, those that are born in August live up to 9 months. Why should that be? Why would there be any significant change at all than previous generations? I mean, seriously, why the stark contrast? This isn't a little tweak. This is living like 9 times longer than you were living before in that generation. Why? What's triggering it? Why would that be necessary? Again, especially when this migratory pattern had not developed yet, it hadn't evolved. Why are these monarchs doing that? Why is this happening? They don't have a journey in mind. They're not planning on going anywhere. They're eating and reproducing. That's what they're doing. It's by instinct. They're not having meetings and saying, anyone up for doing something different this time? No, it just happens. And how does living 9 times longer benefit the monarch? Well, if it didn't live longer, it couldn't move far enough away to get out of the cold, harsh, life-ending climate that they were living in. Living 9 months allows them to make it through a fascinating journey during the winter months and return the next spring to start all over again. How does it know when to leave? And among other things, it can detect shortening of days through organs on its antenna. So it starts to know the seasons and times because it's detecting things through their antennae. One other thing is that it detects the rising and the setting of the sun and the angle of the sun in the sky, which enables it to do advanced calculations for navigation. Advanced calculations. Well, that always comes about through random undirected processes, doesn't it? No, not hardly. This is really advanced programming. So they're beginning their journey as far as from the northeast U.S. and even up in Canada, all the way to south central Mexico. They'll travel about 50 miles per day, and they'll end up going up to 3,000 miles total. That's a long way for these little butterflies to fly. And there end up being hundreds of millions of these monarchs in a forest and a mountain range that's west of Mexico City, sometimes landing on the very same tree that their grandparents, or more likely their great-grandparents, roosted on. Really, we'll get to that. That's just bizarre. Again, keeping in mind, they've never been there before. They haven't gone there before. They know nothing about their parents, let alone their grandparents or great-grandparents. They're just eating and reproducing, and they're doing things by instinct. So why are they all of a sudden making a journey they've never made before? So they get down to south central Mexico, and for over 4 months, these butterflies will live in a state of semi-hibernation. So sometime in March, then, they're down in Mexico. they start to awaken and they start feeding for a few weeks to get enough energy for the long journey back to the U.S. or all the way up to Canada. They also restart up that reproduction cycle, which they put on hold temporarily for no apparent reason. Because again, you have to keep in mind, there's not this intended goal at the end that they're shooting for. They're just doing what they do. And they say over evolutionary history, they started doing more and more things, and more things evolved in their bodies, allowing them to do more and more things. Well, again, you can't do this halfway. You got to pretty much do the whole thing or you're dead in the water. So the reproductive cycle begins again, which had been dormant. And then they begin this journey at the same time, coincidentally, at the same time that the milkweeds are returning to southern Texas, which is where the females will lay their eggs, sadly dying shortly afterwards. So they come all the way back from Mexico, lay their eggs, and then they're kind of out of there. They die. That's as long as they live. These successive generations, living only about 4 weeks again, they go back to the shorter lifespans, they move northward slowly, a little bit at a time as the milkweed returns further and further north in the U.S. and in southern Canada. So they're making this huge journey back to lay eggs. They die, that longer journey, or that longer generation dies, and then they lay eggs, and again, they're just living about 4 weeks again, but they're slowly moving north as the temperatures warm up and you get more and more milkweed further north in the U.S. and into Canada. So summarizing the generational journeys. So starting in May, the generation that's born, let's say generation 1, lives 2 to 4 weeks. We'll just say up to like 4 weeks. And it's in the U.S. and in Canada. It's nice out. You got milkweed. And in June, the second generation is born. So about a month later, another generation is born, living 4 weeks in U.S. and Canada. In July, third generation is born, living 4 weeks again in the U.S. and Canada. It's still nice out, milkweed and all that. But then in August, the fourth generation that's born, that's the one that lives 9 months. Now again, how does it know what generation it is? It doesn't. It knows nothing about its, again, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, or anything else. It knows nothing. It's just a monarch butterfly being born, eating, and reproducing. But this one now, born in August, it's always born in August, lives 9 months, 9 times longer than normal. They call this the Methuselah generation. And then in about October, they're eating and storing up a lot of food for a big journey. Starting about October, they make an 8-week journey down to south central Mexico. So October, November, they're flying down there. It's getting a lot colder in the United States. Milkweed's gone. And then they winter in Mexico, December, January, February, kind of in a dormant stage. Again, they shut down their reproductive cycle. And then in March, they start eating quite a bit, return on their reproductive cycle. Again, the females are getting impregnated, but it's not fertilized yet until they get back to Texas, where the milkweed is, and then they lay their eggs, which are then fertilized, and then the larva is born, turned into a caterpillar, and then they will slowly start heading further north in the United States with successive generations going back to just living 4 weeks again. That's an incredible cycle. Again, think about some egg that was laid millions and millions of years ago that somehow turned into a caterpillar. I mean, that's incredible in and of itself, but it's a caterpillar. And then let's say the caterpillar mates with another caterpillar and has caterpillar eggs, and it turns into another caterpillar. And it does it over and over. Caterpillar, caterpillar eggs, caterpillars, caterpillar eggs, on and on and on. There's no butterflies that have never been heard of. Can't even imagine what they are. But through evolutionary history, they start to morph into more complex individuals, and they go through all these stages, which are dead ends in the middle unless you can get all the way through. A good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Nelson with the Discover Institute, I have lunch with him whenever I can when I'm in his area. He lives in northern Illinois. So when I'm down there speaking, I usually get together with him. Brilliant, intelligent design scientist. And he's got a documentary, which I wanted to mention before. I probably didn't. It's from Illustra Media. It's called Metamorphosis. And I actually got a fair amount of content for this podcast from that documentary called Metamorphosis through Illustra Media. And Paul Nelson is one of the scientists at the interview on here. Did a great job. he's still lecturing on these things and updating it and adding some things. But one analogy that he uses in his current talks, I'm not even sure it was on the DVD, but I know in his current live talks, he's thrown this in there because I think he thought of this analogy of Harry Houdini, great stunt artist and a magician kind of. He was famous for a lot of the stunts that he did. And one was he'd be hung upside down in a straitjacket, all chained up, and then dunked into a water chamber and locked up. And then the sheets pulled over it. And somehow he's able to escape from that death trap in a sense. Houdini did not develop that practice it one piece at a time. Well, first I'll see if I can somehow get a straitjacket around me. And if that's successful, then I'll see if I can do this and do that. When he designed that trick or that stunt, he had a plan from beginning to end to successfully get out at the end. If he didn't, he would have died in the middle and he would have never been successful. He had to have all the steps pre-planned ahead of time before he actually did the trick. I'm not saying he couldn't purposely, intelligently dabble with different, features here and there. Yeah, obviously he did that to practice certain techniques. But he wouldn't have thought about doing this and just dunking himself in there without having already thought through, how am I going to get the handcuffs off and the chains off and then the straitjacket out, off. And then once I get off and I'm free in the water, how do I get out of this tank of water? He didn't plan on thinking about that once he's in the water. He thought about that all ahead of time. He had a plan ahead of time, and then he carried it out. So all the details for that plan were established before he went all the way through with this. It's the same thing with metamorphosis or migration. You can't dabble with this and do it a little bit at a time. If somehow that caterpillar learned how to make a cocoon around itself, and that's all further it thought it through, it's dead. It's trapped inside its own coffin. It's dead. The whole thing has to be established before it starts. That's intent. That's purpose. That's design. That's beautiful. So that's the point with all of this. I think this is great, great evidence for design. And again, if it doesn't qualify, tell me why. And number two, explain how this did happen through undirected processes over millions of years by copying errors in the DNA. And then thirdly, give me an example of something you would have to see that would qualify as evidence for design. I'll probably end with this. The Bible tells us very clearly, no one is ever going to be able to stand before God, look him in the eye and say, I would have believed in you, but you didn't give me enough evidence. Now, we read this specifically in Romans chapter 1. God's going to say, oh no, I gave you plenty of evidence, but you chose to reject it. In fact, I even put the knowledge of my existence inside of you, but I also gave you the ability to make decisions and choose. You could choose to accept that and honor me as your creator, or you could somehow think you know even better than me and do your own thing. I'm going to let you make that decision, but I also reserve the right for the consequences of rejecting me as your creator. And the rest of Romans 1 says what happens to people when they decide to ignore all of this fascinating evidence from astronomy and biology and geology, genetics, and all of that. God will not force himself on you. You don't want to be with him? You don't have to. You can spend all of eternity separated from God. But the problem is once you die, you're going to be able to think clearly again, and you're going to realize the big mistake you made, but then it'll be too late. So that is the entire reason why I do podcasts. It really has nothing to do with caterpillars or butterflies or anything else. It has to do with that singular message of how we got here, why we're here, what happened to this world we're in, what happens to us when we die. The Bible covers all of that. It gives us evidence that it really is a message from God. The things that are in there are actually true, not just made up by a bunch of people, and now we have another religious option for us to choose from. No, it actually has evidence that it really is from the Creator, telling us what happens to us when we die. The bad news is this Creator that we have violated his standards. He's 100% perfect and holy. He cannot have fellowship with things that are imperfect. We are sinful human beings. We've taken the free will he gave us and chosen to reject him and sin against him. We've separated ourselves from him. He didn't push us away. We walked away. Now, if we want to try to correct that, we could try to be better and do a lot of good things. And if we sacrificed our own life, we might, in a sense, pay for our own sins, but then we're dead and we're done. That's not going to help us. So we can try to be as good as possible, but God says all your efforts are way, way short of perfection. That's the bad news. The good news is, he says, you don't have to work like super hard and still be way short. He provided a way for us to reestablish our relationship with him. He sent his own son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross, who was perfect. He took on the sins of the world. He's paying our penalty. He didn't have to. It wasn't his fault. But out of love for us, he was willing to do this, to die on a cross, to rise again, to pay for the sins of the world, so that those who use their free will to say, you know what, I'm going to choose that. I want to be forgiven for my sins. I don't think I can handle this on my own. I don't know more than you. I'm willing to trust you. I am accepting the free gift. I don't have to work for it or earn it. I'll never deserve it. It's a free gift, and I am accepting that right now. Please forgive me of my sins so that I can reestablish my relationship with you. So even though I'm going to mess up the rest of my life, I know that it's covered. The blood of Christ covers that. I want to get better and better, to sin less and less, but I don't have to be so paranoid that if one sin's going to be, nope, that was too much. I know you put your trust in Christ, but you didn't work hard enough after that. It's not by works. The Bible is so clear. Our salvation and forgiveness is not by the works that we do. It's totally a gift of God from his grace that we accept by faith. But it's your choice. If you want to still think you know better than that, that's fine. God will not force you to spend eternity with him. But you will be separated from him, and at that point, you'll understand who he really is, how much he really loved you, but now it's too late. That's why I do podcasts. So if I can show you evidence that something was designed, you might start to think, maybe there is a designer, maybe there is a creator. I wonder who that creator is. Well, the Bible claims to talk about who that creator is, and it gives a lot of evidence that that is the actual creator. And there's a lot of evidence that Jesus Christ actually was here 2,000 years ago. He was actually crucified. He was dead for 3 days, and he came back to life. He had eyewitnesses. He's appeared to over 500 people all at the same time. They weren't all delusional, just thinking they saw all the same delusion. No, it actually happened. And there's eyewitness accounts, there's written records, and there's so much evidence for the resurrection. I will be doing an interview with the world's leading expert on the resurrection. I'll be doing that hopefully later this year. We'll get into that in more detail. The Bible's claims are true. It's the only truth. The only way to God is through Jesus Christ. That's why we do podcasts. I want you to clearly understand that. I'm not about just giving trivia out there like, isn't it really cool, the monarch butterfly and all that. No, that we're missing the point if we stop there. Then we just grab lunch. It's all about the truthfulness of the Bible, and the most important message in the Bible is Jesus Christ. That's the only thing that really matters. If you want to quibble on some of the other details of creation, all that, I'm okay with that. But you don't want to quibble with the Jesus thing. Who do you say Jesus is? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes unto the Father but by me. That's his claim. If you believe that, you will spend eternity with your Creator. If you don't, that's your choice, but then you will be separated in punishment for rejecting your Creator who loved you, who actually paid the price for your penalty. In a sense, what a waste was that for him to do that when you reject it. You didn't even take advantage of it. He did it anyway. Even though he knows whether you're going to choose to accept him or not. He already knew that at the time. He died anyway, so that anyone who would want to accept that, they can. So don't make that a waste. Don't make the wrong choice. If you have questions, you can get a hold of us through our website. Again, this is Starting Point Podcast. The ministry is thestartingpointproject.com, thestartingpointproject.com. Get a hold of us. We should be getting a new website soon, actually. Won't be majorly different, but it'll be kind of cool. But you can always contact us through that, ask any questions that you might have. We have tons of great free resources, lots of free videos, articles, and a bunch of other things. I've also written some books, so take advantage of that if you have any questions. So what's coming up next? What's the next topic? I have no idea, which is usually the case unless I'm in the middle of a series, but we just finished this series. I don't know what the topic is. God does. When He lets me know, I will let you know, and we'll see you next time. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Starting Point Podcast. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe, tell a friend, and please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's the number one way to help us reach more and more people with these important and inspiring messages. To learn more about myself, Jay Siegert, and the Starting Point Project, please visit us at thestartingpointproject.com. We'll catch you next time.